Okay, everyone. Hope you're doing fine. And welcome to this webinar. I hope you can see my screen and you can hear me clearly. If not, drop a message on our chat. I'm here today with my colleague, Jane, so she will be looking also after Q&A and questions, and we'll try to get them answered by the end of the session. If not, I will come back to you as promised. Slides and video of this presentation will be available later on YouTube. So you can always go back and find the information that was useful. So today's topic is about Calico together with Rancher. And we'll talk a little bit about that to see what's possible and not, and how easy it actually is to integrate both. If you have questions, please shoot. We'll take time to take a look at them. So I'm Philip. I've a very long history in networking and security, but that's mainly because of my age. And since 4 or 5 years, I'm pretty interested in everything around Kubernetes networking and the hacking of containers and Kubernetes. Please check us out on LinkedIn or on Twitter. And we hope you can enjoy the information we provide. So today, as we mentioned, we'll talk about Calico Tagira, who is the company behind Calico, what is the power of Calico on Rancher. We can discuss some design considerations on how to customize Calico, and we'll do a small demo to show you how easy it is, and if you want to reproduce it, how easy this can be done. So Calico, as you might know, Project Calico, as we refer to it, is an open source networking solution for Kubernetes, but also for VMs, which is not often mentioned, but it's perfectly possible to run Calico across Kubernetes and VM workloads that are sitting in a cloud or on-premise. Calico is used in quite a lot of environments. Pretty important is that most of the big managed Kubernetes platforms do support Calico, some the networking part, but all of them do support Calico networking security policies, which is a cool thing because it means that your policies that you're creating can be transferred to any type of environment, which is interesting to know if we look at Rancher, because Rancher can actually manage most of these environments, and Calico can take care of the networking as well as the security of these environments. So I'm going to go through the entire list, but know that Calico networking and security is powering most of these environments. We know about more than 1 million nodes that are powered by Calico. Quite often I get the question, why would I use Calico and not something else? Well, it typically works with 1 or 2 or 3 nodes, but when it comes to scale and performance, Calico is one of the most performing and most scalable networking solutions there are when we talk about Kubernetes. So feel free to check it out, and it's as easy to install as all other technologies. Tagira is the company behind Calico. Calico is, as I mentioned, open source. It's developed by the community and by Tagira. Calico open source is also a very big part of what is known as Calico Enterprise, which is, as you will see later on in the demo, the added value Tagira brings to Calico. We're used across all global enterprises, whether it's open source, but also for enterprise. And I hope to show you and address why this is the case later on in the presentation. So today we're going to talk about Rancher. Rancher is an open source project that will allow you to actually manage Kubernetes clusters. It's pretty easy to deploy Kubernetes clusters based on templates and credentials. It's only down to applying a few clicks in a web UI or to actually launch a cluster config file. And after a few minutes, you will have a Kubernetes cluster in the desired cloud or environment. Tagira Calico, on the other side, will take care of the networking as well as the networking security for one. But Tagira is also a very powerful tool when we talk about multi-cluster, which Rancher can deliver, while Tagira and Calico Enterprise, the product, is perfectly capable of doing multi-cluster management of the networking / security in these environments. So now if you check out Rancher, you will see that Rancher has Calico included, as a few others. If you want to install a Kubernetes cluster with Calico, just select Calico. And at that point, you probably have the most advanced, most feature-rich networking solution there is available. And I'm not saying that because I'm working for Tagira and Calico, but if you think about it, Kubernetes clusters, the networking can be very complex. In some cases, you have a need for encapsulation, but in other use cases, you really don't need, or it's not preferable to have encapsulated traffic. So you want to have IP routable pods. Well, if you go for the Calico option, well, you can have all these different ways of encapsulating or uncapsulating out of the box. You can use route redistribution, which can announce services or pods into a network. Pretty cool. You have access to native Kubernetes, but also the advanced Kubernetes, advanced Calico networking policies, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So for sure, take a look at it. If not, it's pretty easy to do. If you want to actually install a Rancher cluster or cluster with Calico, well, it's pretty simple. You only need the default tooling like kubectl, of course. You can use Calico CTL, but it's not a prerequisite. Have to think about the networking and how you want to actually take care of that. As I mentioned, you can use very simple networking, but you can go to top-of-rack routing or dual top-of-rack peering and so on and so forth. So if you have a complex network in which you have to integrate Kubernetes, well, Calico is your choice. On the network policy part, Calico, as I mentioned, extends the networking security part by having actually networking policies that can be applied on a namespace, but also on a global level. It actually means that this is pretty cool to actually apply policies across your entire cluster or environment. We both support IP tables, which is the default for kubeproxy, as well as IPVS. And if you're interested, we're not only talking about IP tables, data planes, we also support eBPF, which is a newer way and a fast way. Check out our website. It's available for Calico and Calico Enterprise, as well as, not to forget, we also support HNS, so the host networking service for Windows. This means that you can actually extend your Kubernetes cluster and mix Windows and Linux. With Calico, you can have networking, linking it together and using these advanced policies. So, as always, whether we install it on bare metal or through Rancher or some other way, we always have to think about what are the IP addressing we are going to use. Yeah? So we should always think upfront before we install Calico or any other type of CNI. What is the CIDR, so the networking range we're going to use for the pods? Yeah? Meaning that in this case it will be 1042/16. That means that every pod will get an IP address out of this range. A second very important part in Kubernetes is the service range. So when Kubernetes creates Kubernetes services like Kubernetes or anything else that you want to expose out of the cluster, this is assigned from a totally different networking range. So these are the two things we need to think about. It's always good to know when you install Calico, Calico will use the cluster CIDR, and based on the cluster CIDR, we will actually create smaller ranges known as IP pools to assign to the clusters. So think about it, you can make very flexible and very efficient routing in between your nodes. But if you configure it through a normal, you have to provide it through Rancher. You can actually provide it through the UI or through a cluster configuration file. Okay, so another thing to take into account is whether we're going to use Vxlan or IPMP encapsulation, or don't we actually need encapsulation? So as I mentioned, this is one of the good things about Calico is the flexibility and the way you can actually fine-tune the networking. Or taking into an account, quite often we get asked this question, how many pods can we typically put on a node? How many nodes should I actually use? Yeah. The answer is typically, as you will see through most documentation, around 110. So quite often Calico assigns a /24 networking range per node, which is about 250 IP addresses. Because of the dynamic nature of the pods, we typically count 2 available IP addresses so that we do not run out of IP addresses. That's where we count with 110. This is also what is actually used inside of AWS, if you would wonder. So to set up Calico or Kubernetes cluster on Rancher, it's pretty easy. What I did was to prepare for this demo. It's actually pretty simple. I went to the Rancher quick start guide. I spun up a Linux host and installed Docker on it. Pretty straightforward. And I run this command, which will actually spin up a Rancher cluster in K3S. And at that point, you can actually connect to it through a web UI. This is not the most safest, not the most stable installation you can do. This is for demo purposes, but it will show you all the options. If you consider to install Rancher, reach out to Rancher, of course. And at that point, they can guide you through how you can set up a robust and redundant cluster. But for the sake of this demo, copy pasting this line is actually way more than enough. So let me see if I can find my browser tab. Nope. 1 second. Okay, so this is actually what you get when you sign in. Let me show this from scratch. So once you connect to your Rancher cluster, and one thing I noticed, if you want to quickly play around, the first time you actually launch the Rancher cluster, it will ask you for a URL to connect to, which is this one here I'm using for myself. This URL needs to be reachable from your nodes. Yeah. Take that in mind, because it took me quite some time to troubleshoot it. But once this is resolvable by DNS, it works as a SHA. So first time you log in, you're asked to create a password, of course. So I already did this. And when we log in, we actually get an overview of the clusters are already deployed to prepare and to play around with. So creating a cluster in an environment is pretty straightforward. I'll take the quickest one, but as you can see, I already used it on AWS EC2. You can import clusters from AKS if you want to. You can deploy directly in AKS. I already deployed Kubernetes clusters into DigitalOcean. It's quite straightforward. So the only thing you need to actually do is say, add cluster. Let's do it in DigitalOcean. It's the fastest way. We give it a name. And then we actually give our worker nodes or master nodes a name. So laser master, for example. We need a control plane and we need etcd. Yeah. And we can add some worker nodes to the equation, which are only worker nodes. And this is basically it. Yeah. How does Rancher know how to connect to DigitalOcean? How does Rancher know what images to deploy? Well, this is all defined into that template. We'll take a look at it right after I click create. You can choose the Kubernetes versions, and of course, most important thing is that we'll actually select Calico as our networking provider. This is basically it. Yeah. If you don't like the click and drop-down menus, well, you can always go to the YAML file. You can actually see what the cluster config is and modify whatever you need to modify. Yeah, it's as simple as that. Once we're ready, the only thing left to do is actually click create. And at that moment, my Rancher cluster is going to provision. It's going to connect automatically to DigitalOcean. Of course, authenticated. It will actually create the nodes. It will install Docker. It will install Kubernetes and so on and so forth. Cool thing is that if you actually go to the nodes, you'll see that they are created. And if you click on the nodes, you can actually see the status and what is being deployed and so on and so forth. And I'm going to wait for this. It takes about 4 or 5 minutes. And when we are ready, we'll see that our cluster is active in a few seconds. If you take a look at the node templates, well, they're pretty easy to look at. You can create one simply for the sake. We can actually say whether we're using DigitalOcean. We'll actually select the token. That's something you get from DigitalOcean or your AWS credentials. And then you answer basic information about which region or availability zone, how much memory, which image, and so on and so forth. But that's essentially it. So once you do this, it becomes very easy, repeatable to redeploy this cluster. For sure, if you have the cluster YAML file, you can actually just relaunch the cluster YAML file and it will actually clone or create a similar cluster as now. So let me go back here, still waiting to be installed. As I said, it takes a few minutes. So we'll come back here later on. Let's go back to our presentation. So it's pretty easy to install it. It's pretty quick also. So if you want to play around, it's pretty quick to do. So this is Calico open source, yeah, which is installed. So I'll show you the access right away. Now, if we want to install Calico Enterprise on Rancher, this is also a supported combination. And it's not way more complex. It just requires you to install, of course, Calico Enterprise, which is pretty straightforward. If you install Calico Enterprise, you get quite a lot of added value. Most important is that we have security controls. We'll get compliance reporting. We can do way more fine-grained, typically egress access, meaning we can base ourselves based on DNS names, for example. And the biggest win of all is visibility and troubleshooting. Nothing is as difficult as troubleshooting networking and security problems inside of a Kubernetes cluster. The way networking policies work, while using Calico Enterprise, this becomes pretty straightforward, and you have all the information you actually need to do this. This is something we typically consider when we talk, but once you actually want to start out with Calico Enterprise, once you get familiar and you have an idea of what you want to do, well, it's very important that we start out with Calico Enterprise when we talk about pre-production or piloting, meaning that at that point you can learn and understand and troubleshoot your requirements. So a very good thing to start at an early level. We can help you with training. There's a slide on that later on to get you familiar, to discuss the architecture about how you can actually set up your clusters and to help you get to a very good performant and scalable solution throughout your Kubernetes journey. So in Calico Enterprise, there are a few things which are necessary to take into account. One is policy tiering. We'll show it in the demo later on. Policies allows you to actually segment your policies and apply role-based access control to it so that you can actually delegate the rights to fine-tune policies to other teams. We can see very advanced Flowlock information, which namespace is connecting to which namespace and so on and so forth. You can actually visually see and trace the flows into Kubernetes, which is pretty cool to see. We added support for DNS policies. As you know, everything is DNS based nowadays. Well, based on the DNS names, we can grant access to, for example, specific APIs. And last but not least, for sure, in a world where we tend to spin up quite a lot of clusters, delete a lot of clusters for dev testing and so on and so forth, a tool like Rancher is pretty useful. We can end up easily up to 10 or 100 clusters. Of course, the next question is, how do we manage the security? And this is where Calico Enterprise comes in. This is a screenshot of the policy tiering. Policies in Calico Enterprise and in Calico, as you probably already know, are actually more advanced, meaning that they can have an option to actually block or deny traffic. They can be global from nature instead of namespaced. Order is important. So that's, I think, one of the biggest differentiators because compared to Kubernetes, that the policies are ordered. And with Calico Enterprise, we can put them in separate tiers. These tiers are analyzed from left to right and top to down. And for example, the security team can be managed, or the security tier can be managed by a total different team than, for example, platform or developers. As you can see in the security team in this screenshot, for example, which rules would you put at this higher level? For example, quarantining rules or access to blocked IP addresses like Tor exits and stuff like that. Yeah. So these are measures that we can put in place so that everybody has to go through these, let's say, security checks before we can actually access or communicate inside of the cluster. Advanced flow locks. Yeah, I'll show it straight into the UI later on, but you can actually trace every connection between a pod and another pod up to a very detailed level. I'll show it straight away. This is a screenshot of the flow visualizer. The flow visualizer might look very complex at this screenshot, but it's actually a cool way to visualize all the traffic inside of your Kubernetes cluster. And by selecting namespaces and so on and so forth, we can actually see what is originating from a namespace or communicating with that namespace. And as such, we can actually see what traffic is allowed, denied, which policies are involved, and so on and so forth. So, for sure, a good thing to take a look at. DNS based policies, as you know, typically cloud APIs or cloud endpoints, they tend to change from IP address. Yeah. Nothing can predict nowadays the IP address of a specific service, whether it is using global distribution or global DNS load balancing or something similar. It's pretty hard to predefine the IP addresses. While in Calico Enterprise, we can actually create networking policies based on the DNS names. Yeah? So we can create policies in a way like, for example, access to wildcard.twilio.com is allowed. All the rest is blocked. So another one is, for example, Slack. You might have bots that communicate with Slack, while you can grant the access very generally, regardless of the IP addresses Slack or Twilio or Salesforce are behind. It's also a pretty interesting way to integrate with relational databases, which are typically not somewhere in your Kubernetes cluster, but typically a VM or a service somewhere on the internet or in the cloud. Well, based on the names, we can control access to these databases and so on and so forth. It's one of the most asked features when we talk about Calico Enterprise. And then the multi-cluster management. If you think a little bit about this concept, you might create networking policies by applying a YAML file throughout your cluster. Well, if you create a second cluster, you have to repeat this and so on and so forth. If you have tens or hundreds of clusters, this can be very troublesome and error prone. So one good approach is to go for multi-cluster management. This essentially means that you will have one cluster, whether it's using production workloads or not, it really doesn't matter, but one cluster, and it might share, for example, your Rancher cluster, which is managing the infrastructure, which is connecting to all the other different type of clusters you're managing. All your logs are centralized at the management cluster. All the visibility is centralized. All the policies are centralized and so forth. So you can basically, how would I say, create one policy and propagate it throughout all the clusters that you have in place. It's a new feature since version 3.3. So it's out for, I think, 4 or 5 months right now. It's getting a lot of attention, and it's for sure a cool way to manage policies across your ever-growing environment. Installing it, again, is pretty simple. We can do it in a similar way. The only thing you need to take into account is that you have to install your Kubernetes cluster with a no networking plugin installed, because Calico Enterprise is installing its own networking plugin. Now, if you already have clusters installed with Calico. For sure, if AWS or DigitalOcean like I did, you can fairly easily upgrade from Calico open source to the enterprise version if you want to, or you want to try it out after this training. So that's perfectly possible. And you have, of course, need to provision a permanent volume and a storage class and so on and so forth, with the idea of storing, of course, logging data that you require. But it's pretty straightforward. If you go to docs.tagira.io, it's all explained and actually made ready for consumption by a simple copy paste. I'll go through the demo in a few minutes. I'm going to terminate these slides, and then I don't have to come back here. There are a few other events that will come up in the coming weeks. Please go to tagira.io/events, and you can always sign up there. I also encourage you to sign up for our Slack channel. There is a Calico Slack channel. And please, if you have ideas about webinars or topics that you want to address, which is using Calico, please do so. Send an email to myself or Jane. The more suggestions we get, the more we can choose. If you're the only one, the chances are big that your idea gets picked up. So please send us some ideas, and we'll happily look after if we can make a webinar around this or do a demo or something similar. Any ideas are welcome. Something new has been launched very recently. We'll be hosting free certified Calico trainings. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 2 days of content that you can spread across a couple of days or weeks. You can already pre-register. These trainings are being given by advanced Calico engineers, and it will yield you a certificate towards the end of the training. It's free. You can do it from your place. There are labs that will be available and documented. So cool way to get your certification. So please feel free to do that. Another thing we recently made available is our ebook, which is about Kubernetes networking. It's a very technical ebook. It's written by our CTO and quite some other smart guys in our company, and explains the ins and outs of Kubernetes networking, why Calico, how to use Calico, why Calico is scalable, and so on and so forth. Just click on the links. You will get these slides right after the webinar. So please download the ebook. It's a cool way to have technical information in a readable form. If you're interested in the Calico Enterprise trial and use all and test out all these features, you go to tagira.io/trial. There are 2 ways to do that. I said it last time, but we added a very particular way to do that. So if you go to Calico Enterprise trial, you can actually opt and ask for a 7-day trial in a hosted sandbox, which is something we spin up. We'll give you access. You can do some demos. You can play around with some apps and so on and so forth. But it's all controlled and hosted by ourselves. A second way to do it is you can spin up an own cluster, for example, a simple EKS cluster, and actually link it to a system of ourselves where you will be able to access the UI, logging, and so on and so forth. So at that point, you don't have to care about storage, having the necessary resources, and so on and so forth. But you can enjoy and test on your own cluster all the technology and features I just discussed. So feel free to do that. We'll get back to you on how to do it, but at the end of the day, you get an email with a command to execute once you execute that command on your Kubernetes cluster, it will automatically connect to a hosted Calico Enterprise environment, and you will be able to play around with it on your own cluster and your own applications. Okay, this is more or less it from a slide perspective. So let me go back to my demo environment. If I can find it. So, okay. So as you can see, this is the cluster I just created with a typo. It's up and running. Once I go to this cluster, as you can see, when I'm in this cluster, you can see the nodes I spin up and so on and so forth. I can actually go inside of these nodes, see if everything is working and so on and so forth. If you're not familiar with Rancher, it's pretty easy as we've seen. You can also download the SSH keys, which will allow you to actually SSH into the nodes. And of course, important is if you go to the cluster view, you need to execute kubectl command. So you can do that through a built-in shell, or you can actually download the kubeconfig file. You can download the file or copy paste it. Once you have that on your machine, well, it becomes pretty simple. For example, if I would use this, let me enlarge this. So at this point, I'm still on my MacBook. So what I downloaded the kubeconfig file, of course. So that's what it is here. So once I have this, it's all in place. This is not the DigitalOcean one. I already prepared this. So once we export this file like this, or you have to put it on the correct place on the file system. But I always do it like this. Once we do this, we can actually kubectl get nodes, and I typed a mistake from config. And if I now do kubectl get nodes, if everything works well, I should see that I have my demo environment working. You can see the roles that has been assigned and so on and so forth. So it's pretty simple right now to go on and see what pods are installed on my cluster. If you want to make sure once you create a cluster with Rancher, you can actually see that it installs some agents. These agents report back with the Rancher Kubernetes cluster we are using, and provides, of course, all these statistics. And right now, it's pretty simple. We can see whether we have something installed, for example, in kubectl get pods in this namespace. For example, we can see the pods. Let's see, didn't try it before, but should be actually seeing that 1042 were the IP addresses I mentioned in the beginning from the pod cider that was assigned. If you get SVC, we might see the other one. You'll see 1043, which was the default, but you can change it when you actually create the cluster. Managing policies is exactly the same as you typically do. You can do kubectl get networking policies, and let's see, in all namespaces, so everything works well. You see that we already have networking policies in place. These are Kubernetes native networking policies, but I can as well create Calico specific network policies as easy as before. Now, when I say easy as before, creating networking policies is not the easiest thing to do. Might be error prone. So for that reason, we can of course take a look at the Tagira or the Calico Enterprise version of things. So let me switch back here. So if I go here, so this is my, exactly this is the other cluster I have in place, which is this cluster. Where is it? Global. So right now I'm connected to this demo cluster here. So I installed Calico Enterprise on it in a pretty similar way, and it allowed me to connect to it. So didn't put much into it, but I deployed exactly the same application as I did on the open source cluster I just showed. So right now you can actually see the tiers. We can add tiers if we would like to do that. Of course, this will allow us to actually take a look at the policies in a graphical way. As you can see, our policy here is deployed, for example, a namespace. Applies to specific names, labels inside of the namespace. And as you can see here, actually, if we take a look at this, we can actually see that this ingress rule, which means traffic that is going to this Nginx demo service, will only allow traffic coming from pods, siege, up equals siege, which is basically a traffic generator I'm running. So it becomes very, very easy to create rules, ingress, egress, and so forth. We can actually use the more advanced features if we create policies right out of this UI. To give an example, we could actually say add policy. Let's give it a name. As you can see, we can actually create somewhere in the list, because it's ordered, can be of global nature or namespace nature. And we can use Calico advanced features, like, for example, let me do it differently. Let's see, egress. Let's create an egress rule. You can see I have the standard allow feature, but I can use the deny feature and so on and so forth. I can use pod selectors. I can use namespace selectors to select my traffic based on also networking. But as I mentioned during the presentation, it also allows you to create rules based, for example, on, let me show it. For example, things like this. Yeah. So it's a pretty cool feature. We don't have to care about changing IP addresses, and it's on a pod basis. That means that if a pod resolves to something at slack.com, it will get access. If another pod tries to connect to it, it will actually also need to obtain the IP address. So if an IP address changes, it's on a per pod basis, and we'll create the rules accordingly. So pretty simple. Once we have policies in place, once we have traffic in place, of course, we want to make sure that everything is working as we expect it to do. So if we go to the flow visualization, we can actually visualize all the traffic we have in our cluster. As I said, this actually invites us to drill down. So we can actually see, okay, let's see in this demo application, all the traffic. We can zoom into it. We can actually turn on the labels, and we can actually see in this case that our demo app is communicating inside of the namespace. Yeah. But sometimes it also connects to kube system where core DNS is running. So all the communications that are actually originating from this moment on, from this namespace is visualized. If we select the flow, we can actually see who is communicating, which policies are in place from an egress and an egress point of view, as which labels are actually being not applied, but actually being used to identify the traffic. Because as you know, every networking policy is actually based on labels, and based on these labels, we allow access. Now, this is a way I would typically describe as quickly find and visualize all the traffic and essentially click through until we find the information we need. Of course, there is also a way to actually visualize all the log data, the flow logs, as we discussed during the presentation. So let me refresh this. And at this point, what we will actually be seeing is all the traces of all the traffic that are currently happening inside of our clusters. Give it a second to load, and then we will be able to analyze that information. For example, like this, I'm just going to pick out one, but for example, we could use, for example, this one. So you can see this is an aggregated log. There are 425 incidents of this traffic. It will give us very detailed information whether this flow was allowed or denied. Yeah, how many traffic was actually transferred to where this traffic was flowing, yeah, on which destination ports. And also we can figure out, if we scroll down, where this traffic is coming from. As you can see, this was from Nginx 4 to the Echo server in my example. And very, very useful information is how was this traffic handled by our networking policies. Yeah? Because as you know, you can have multiple networking policies that actually apply to a specific pod. So if we analyze our policies from, as in the UI was seen from left to right, we can actually see that by which rule this traffic was allowed or not. Very handy. And it allows you to search through all your traffic. So for example, you can fairly easily create, like I will type it, it's easy. Source namespace, for example, is, let me see if we can, let's take this for an example. Well, it will automatically filter traffic and show us only the relevant traffic. As you can see, it's only available in app routable demo. And a cool thing I figured out earlier was you can actually also, for example, zoom in pretty easily in all the traffic related to, for example, this pod. So if you filter on it, it will automatically create the necessary filters to do that. So understanding flows, knowing why something is allowed or denied, can be done through the Flowlock analyzer. Another very interesting feature of this is because all the traffic that or all the logging information we actually gather from our Kubernetes clusters, and this can be across all clusters. Yeah. We do some interesting stuff with it, as I just shown it. It's something we added recently, is you can also look at how all the DNS traffic is being handled. So if you think that your Kubernetes cluster is slowing down or things aren't working as you expect or tend to slow down, well, a good pointer to take a look at is all the DNS traffic that is actually generated in the cluster. Because as you can see here, this is only up for a few days, I think 1 or 2 days, how many DNS requests are doing. You can actually see all the DNS names by these graphs, when they were done, whether they were external DNS requests, whether there was quad A record requests, and so on and so forth. So this is actually interesting information to further fine-tune your clusters to find errors. Yeah. Cool thing is you can actually see the top 10 domains. Of course, Rancher is in this because our Kubernetes clusters are actually connecting to this. So very interesting information. This all comes with Calico Enterprise. And it will give you a lot of information about how smooth and how much we actually rely on DNS in Calico or in Kubernetes as such. So if you want to check all this out, feel free, go to tagira.io/trial. We can provide you a guide and a license so that you can check out this information yourself. I don't know if there are any questions. Feel free to ask them now. If not, I'm going to close the webinar. But please, if you have any comments, information you need, reach out to Jane or myself, and we will happily come back to you later. Thanks. I see one question popping up. Let me take a look. Can I see it? Let's see. So how do you remove IP and IP, and how do you change the CIDR? The CIDR can be changed actually in the cluster config file here. So let's see. If you create a cluster, let's see if I can quickly show this. You can actually go in there, and it's actually explained here somewhere where you can change the CIDRs. Well, so by incrementing this, you can actually do this. To place the IP in IP, you have to revert to the Rancher documentation and Calico. I don't know by heart, but you can actually specify a Calico option to actually specify how your IP pool will do. What I would personally do, honestly, is create or change it afterwards. But there are options available to disable and fine-tune the IP pool settings, because this is actually what you want to do if you want to remove IP and IP or change it to Vxlan. No more questions. In that case, I'll thank you and hope to see you soon. Please send us some ideas about following webinars, and we'll happily take a look at them. See you guys. Thanks.